All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm here today with Jonathan Harding, the author of the new book, Mensch, Beyond the Cones. Jonathan, how are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me on, Zach.
So, just give everybody an explanation behind, what this book is. I mean, we know it's about coaching and Germany, two things that you were very fond of, but what was the message that you tried to transmit throughout this book?
I think the focus of the book is really about what makes a good coach. And obviously, that's not a question that can be answered uh, distinctly, and probably not even a question that can be answered in 14 chapters in a book. Um, but the focus was definitely on what kind of attributes and what kind of traits are necessary in modern coaching. And each chapter is a designated attribute that's linked to one of the people that I speak to. And really, the focus of the book was to look at all of those attributes and consider what is necessary. And in the end, I felt like the return to human values was one of the most important things that we need to, as a sport, football, but sport generally, needs to take a look at the human aspect of coaching and the fact that coaches, as well as players and everyone involved in the process, they are human beings. They are going to make mistakes, but they also need someone to lean on. They need someone there to help them develop as individuals, not just as a sporting commodity, which I think too often they've been treated as. So it was an opportunity to find out more about what goes on in coaching, but more importantly, as I say, what's necessary going forward, and what really is important for a modern coach. And I think the human approach, the human element was the thing that stood out the most for me.
Yeah, going back to that, the human element. I mean, we've seen a lot of uh, young up and coming coaches pass through Germany. I mean, uh, Domenico Tedesco and Julian Nagelsmann are just a few. I'm sure there are plenty others in the lower leagues of Germany. But what do you think? Do you think there are any aspects of Germany's footballing culture that make it so easy for young guys like Nagelsmann and Tedesco to get their shots at the top level?
I think the biggest thing that gives them young coaches in this country the opportunity is the respected nature of youth football coaching. I mean, I talk about it in the book, but a lot of Bundesliga coaches who got the first team job probably ended up coaching at youth team level at the same club beforehand, and that work is not disrespected. I mean, it's considered important experience, and obviously coaching the first team of a club is something different than coaching the under-19s. But I certainly feel in other leagues, from a distance, obviously, that is not the case. I think particularly in the Premier League, work at youth team level is not necessarily as respected as it is in Germany. I mean, Nagelsmann was coaching at Hoffenheim for a long time before he moved to the first team. Domenico Tedesco had worked at different clubs coaching at youth level before he went to Auer and then on to Schalke. Christian Streich is a great example. I think he had 200 odd games at youth level for Freiburg before he took the first team job. So there's certainly a level of respect. I think that's something that sets Germany apart. And I think that pathway to the first team certainly gives coaches, but also clubs, perspective on how to develop coaching talent. I think that's really, really important. The coaching course itself is extremely detailed, and there's a certain level or a certain standard that's demanded. There have been positive changes made in the last year, moving towards more flexibility and moving towards more of a recognition of human values. Obviously, there's more that can be done, but I think that was the thing that stood out the most in speaking to everyone I spoke to, is that that coaching at youth level is not too different from coaching at first team level. The only difference is more pressure, more publicity, and a slightly better level of player. And that's it. I know that's those are big factors, but ultimately, if that's the high level of youth football, then it gives coaches a really good foundation before making the move to the first team.
So we've seen a lot of young English prospects like Jadon Sancho and Javier Amaechi make the switch from England to Germany for more first team opportunities. Do you think that in a way that could happen to not just English players, but English coaches who are looking to get a chance at coaching at the top level, or is it already happening?
I mean, it's difficult. Obviously, the language is the biggest thing. You've got to be able to have a good grasp on that. And I think if there were any managers in England that were looking to get more experience, I'm sure they would jump at the chance if that was something that they felt matched their character. It's not for everybody. The move abroad, it is a big challenge wherever you decide to go. Different cultures, different languages, different ways of life. In many respects, it's not always something that can be just boiled down to where you're going to get more experience coaching. There are lots of other factors to consider. But I mean, if I would hope that young English coaches who felt they weren't getting opportunities in England would look elsewhere. I mean, it certainly seems to be the case that they have done well in the past. And Brighton's current head coach, Graham Potter, certainly went abroad and coached in Sweden, in Östersund, and did a good job there, having not really got any opportunities in England initially. And I think there are a lot of talented young head coaches in England. And I think maybe taking that step abroad would be the best thing they could do. But as I say, it's really up to them as individuals and whether they think it would be right for their character.
Yeah, I recently read a piece on Bundesliga coaches and talking about how a lot of German prospects are sort of being out-coached or over-coached. And they're so tactically disciplined that, they can follow so many different schemes and instructions. But when it comes to that unpredictable, making that tricky dribble or that run through midfield, they just don't have it in them. Do you think that is a valid issue? Are you seeing stuff like that when it comes to German prospects, or do you think that's being blown up?
No, I definitely think that's a valid issue. I think it's part of the reason that the DFB have decided to change their youth coaching approach in the last few months. I talk about this in the book. One of the people I was lucky enough to listen to at a coaching conference last year was Professor Matthias Lochmann, and his ideas originally built off the ideas of Horst Wein on the concept of Faninho, which is changing youth football to make it more fun, and the details of which I sort of outline in the book. The DFB have accepted those changes largely, and that means that they have recognized the need to promote that kind of player development at youth level, because as you saw in Russia, one of their biggest issues amongst many others was that they lacked a player who was able to deliver in one-on-one situations. And that's why Jadon Sancho, for example, is such a popular player in the Bundesliga and has excelled here, because he's not the type of player that is being grown out of the system at the moment. So I don't think it's being blown out of proportion. I do think it's a problem, and I think that's why the changes were made. The concept of Faninho is to change the setup of the game. You've basically got 4 goals, 2 that you attack and 2 that you defend, and it's 3-on-3, and you're only allowed to score inside or outside a certain area, and everybody has more touches. You don't really have this situation which you do at the moment if it's 7-on-7 on a full-size pitch, or a slightly smaller pitch for young kids, where if you're the left back and you're not the best player, then you maybe touch the ball twice. And who wants that? First of all, that's no fun for the child. Secondly, it's certainly not helping them develop. And what you end up doing is sort of messing around with their positional sense. Are they really a left back at that age? No. And Faninho is the best example, in my opinion, based on the arguments I've heard for both sides, of creating players from a young age that first and foremost have fun playing football and get the opportunity to have as many touches as possible, which I think anyone who's ever played the game would relate to. When we were young, all we wanted to do was score goals and touch the ball a lot. And that's what this game does. And the positive effect of that is that at the end, you end up with more technically gifted players who are more confident in one-on-one situations. So if those changes do work out as planned, then I think in 10 years, you'll end up seeing more talented individual players from Germany who are capable of doing something special in a one-on-one situation.
Right, so Foninho. Yeah, and I do think that sort of explained Germany's collapse in the 2018 World Cup. When you look at, of course, Leroy Sané, probably one of the few who can, make a difference just based on his own individual talent, was left out of the squad, and we saw so many. It became so predictable in many ways.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't personally have a problem with Sane not going. I've come out on record and said this quite a few times because I think there were other issues at play there. I mean, Löw seemed to suggest that he wasn't going to be happy to be a squad member, and obviously coming off the season that he had, Sane had strong arguments to suggest that he was capable of producing that magic. You know, Julian Brandt was on the plane. I thought that Julian Brandt had a very good season and offered a little bit more flexibility than Leroy Sané in the squad. And I think at a World Cup, that's something to consider. Plus, Brandt is also a player capable of one-on-one skill. It's just not necessarily the same type as Sané. So, and I think there were other failings. So there was an arrogance to the German team. There was a tactical naivety. There was a collective issue within the squad, and of course the entire situation with Ilkay Gundogan and Mesut Ozil was poorly handled. So I think there were a number of factors at play, and I think if Leroy Sané had been on the plane, obviously it's easy to say with hindsight he would have made a difference, but he may well have also succumbed to that environment because, you know, having seen it from the outside and followed them around for those 3 games, albeit a very brief World Cup in Russia, there was certainly a sense of intensity and pressure in that situation, and you know it's difficult for young players. So yeah, I think what's clear now is that Leroy Sané will be the most important player for Germany going forward, along with Serge Gnabry, because they're capable of doing those things on a more regular basis, and they've proved that. But you know, it will be interesting to see who follows in the future and who the next ones are. I mean, Kai Havertz is obviously the one that everybody's talking about right now, but you know, interesting down the line in 5-10 years.
Right, and I mean, just going back to 2012, you know, I had the impression that Germany excluded a few members of the old generation that still had something to offer for the Euros. Instead they gave those minutes to really just kind of the new generation. You know, players like, I don't know, Ozil or Mueller, just giving more, you know, perhaps sacrificing their performance in 2012 to build on for, you know, 2014 or 2016. And obviously it paid off. At least that's what it seemed to me. Do you think we could be seeing something similar perhaps in 2020 or 2022 of
That's
Germany's?
always difficult. Yeah, I mean, Germany definitely need to rebuild and reset, and I think they should have done that straight after winning the World Cup in 2014. I think they were okay in 2016. They had a couple of good games, but I think the downward spiral had already begun at that point. And I think you need to make wholesale changes when you come to the end of a journey. I think all of the greatest sports sides in the history of sport have recognized those moments. I mean, I can only speak from the experiences that I've seen and watched as a journalist, but also as a fan over the years. But when I think about the England rugby team winning the World Cup in 2003, that was the end of an extremely long journey, and things changed dramatically after that. You know, when you reach the pinnacle of your achievement and you reach that, you have to recognize that in order for the team to move on, changes need to be made. Obviously, a lot of people will have wanted Joachim Löw to leave. I think it would have made sense, but unfortunately, the German FA's failings don't just stop at how they performed in on the pitch. They didn't line up a successor, and they never had a backup plan. I think that was part of the reason that they played so poorly in 2018, is that they seemed to carry on with this arrogance. Well, we won it 4 years ago, we'll be fine. And I think that was, you know, part of the mindset issue that they had. And as for development, yeah, I think it has to change. You know, Löw's decision to remove Müller and Hummels and Boateng basically and retire them is a swift decision to move forward. There are arguments on both sides to be made, whether it was right or not. He's obviously recognised that he needs to change his approach in order to keep his job. I don't imagine that after 2020 he'll still be in the seat. And I think Germany have got to be making plans 2 years ago, basically, for his successor. But it's also about playing style, and it's also about changes. You know, Germany need to recognise that Kai Havertz, very fortunately for Joachim Löw, is the new playmaker. You know, if Mesut Ozil is now no longer in the picture, they're very fortunate that a player like Kai Havertz has landed in their lap. But it's also a question of recognising who's going to come through next. You know, how do you deal with the defence? What do you do about wing backs? Who's going to sit in midfield? Do they have a striker? Who's that going to be? You know, all of these questions need to be asked. There are some great players at under 21 level, but it's whether they can make the jump, whether the system is right. But Germany definitely do need to make a cut, I suppose, or draw a line under it and say we need to change. It's not about looking at what we achieved 4 or 5 years ago. It's looking about building to see what we can achieve in 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure they're going to compete in 2020. I'll be interested to see where they're at in 2022, and especially in 2026 when the World Cup is in the US and Mexico and Canada. I think that could be the end of the road for the next generation if they get their planning right now. But obviously, a lot of things have to go right before then.
Right. Yeah, of course. So when you started writing this book, obviously you had a lot of background knowledge. But what was the one thing that surprised you the most when researching this book?
I think it was just the depth of knowledge, I think, in the system. Researching the book, I was really inspired to write it because I read a couple of other books, particularly Living on the Volcano by Michael Calvin, which is a great book about managers and coaches in England. And I thought, wow, it's strange. Everybody talks about German football, or not everybody, but lots of people talk about German football being some sort of a blueprint, especially German coaches. And why hasn't there really been anything about that? And I think in doing my research, obviously, it was difficult to figure out who I wanted to speak to. It would have been great to have the opportunity to speak to coaches like, Julian Nagelsmann or Florian Kohfeldt of Werder Bremen, but sometimes it's not always possible. And on the other hand, I'm really happy with the people that I ended up speaking to because, really what this book is about is recognizing that there are lots of members of a coaching staff, not just the head coach, and that many people contribute to success on a Saturday. But it's also about recognizing that every one of those people is an individual, and they also have desires and feelings, and that was something that I think really interested me. And yeah, in terms of what surprised me most, I think it was just the sheer amount of knowledge. When I went to speak to Frank Volmut, who used to be the head coach of coaching at the DFB, it's now Daniel Ninkowski. Just the sheer breadth and detail that was involved in getting the top level badge. I mean, obviously that sounds like something that would be there if you're going for the top level badge, but it was really mind blowing that you talk about minimum amounts of hours of learning in UEFA. I think it's something like 200 or 240. I can't remember. And Germany does something like 800. And you have to ask yourself why. And they say, well, if we're going to do something, we want to do it right. And obviously they have the facilities and the finance to do that. But it really just sort of blew me away that the level of detail that's available for coaches these days. But at the same time, if you have all of this involved, what really struck me at the end of research and at the end of the first draft was, wow, a coach is expected to do so much. And is it actually possible for one man or one woman to do this? Because personally, on the back of all of this work and speaking to so many people, I don't think it is. I think you need different people for different jobs. I think you need one person to coach and develop young players, and you need one person to win on a Saturday. And then you need a whole other group of other people to help in specialist fields. But, it's getting more and more demanding for head coaches. I can only see the size of staff increasing in the future.
Right. You feel that the way the German the higher ups in the German Federation have it. Do you feel that coaches have the freedom to explore different systems, and because it seems that in some countries coaches are often too similar. They'll play the same system. They'll all be too defensive or too offensive. Do you think there's a good healthy dose of diversity when it comes to the systems and the tactics in German coaches?
I think one thing you got to look at, or maybe there's two ways to look at it. One, I think German football was heavily influenced by Jurgen Klopp's decision to sort of, with the press back when he was first at Dortmund and he won the title. That's had a huge, long-lasting impact on German football. And secondly, or sort of in that first part of the assessment, is also Pep Guardiola's influence in German football. I think, in the book we talked about it with one of the coaches, and he said, I think people suddenly felt like they could change tactics in a game and that wouldn't be recognized as a mistake anymore. I mean, the influence of Pep Guardiola in German football is vastly understated. I think wherever he goes, he has a massive impact. And that's certainly changed the way that coaches have approached the game here. The combination of Klopp back then and Guardiola more recently is one aspect. But the other aspect is that Bundesliga clubs outside of Bayern have had to do different things in the transfer market to stay alive. So if you have to do things differently there, and that includes coaching recruitment, then that also means you have to play a certain way to accommodate those players. So I think that in itself is creating a fairly creative system. My only potential concern would be that everybody likes to press and everybody likes to play this high tempo Leipzig kind of football, but not everybody can do it. Obviously, some teams take it to an extreme, like Leipzig. But I think what we're seeing more and more now, especially as the Premier League continues to sort of benefit off the scouting of the Bundesliga, if you like, is that we're seeing teams who are adapting to the players that they can sign based on their work in the transfer market, getting coaches that will get the best out of those players, and then finding a system that works based on the players. I think a lot of coaches in Germany have the tactical flexibility to change things up at the top level. But I think it's the combination of past coaching influence and transfer market dealings that have ultimately led Germany to where they are at the moment tactically. Yeah, I think there is enough diversity, but there's never enough diversity. It's always one of those things where you could always see more variation. But I certainly don't feel like everybody's playing 4-2-3-1 every week, so can't complain.
Right. Now you mentioned that Joachim Löw will probably step down in 2020. Do you see any potential replacements at the moment, or is it a mixed field? Is it such a diverse crowd that it's impossible to know who will step up? Or
I think it's difficult. I mean, yeah. I don't know whether there's anyone that's a standout, and I think that's part of the problem. It's such a specific job. You have to be the really right kind of character to do it. I think a lot of German coaches really enjoy the intensity of the day-to-day, the weekly game, the weekly test, as it were. You have to have the right temperament to be able to calmly approach things every few months and keep a keen eye on players over that time when you're not coaching. And it takes a different type of coach. You have to be able to bring a squad together, a group together, and get them to perform in a very short period of time with a group that doesn't necessarily have the opportunity to play together or work together as often as you would at club level. So, you're already looking at a very specific type of coach. And at the moment in Germany, most coaches, I would say, coming out of the system are keen to get involved on a more weekly basis, as I say. I think Stefan Kunz's work at the under-21 level is impressive, back-to-back under-21 finals. He's certainly changed his image from his days as a club manager and working at clubs to being slightly different. He was also speaking at one of the conferences that I saw, and he certainly gave a good impression. I certainly feel like he would not be a bad choice. Especially because if you're making the transition into the future and the next step from Germany, he would be able to bring a lot of those players with him from the under-21s. And you've got that transitional factor of having the same coach along the way, which would be beneficial, of course. But Germany need to be making these decisions and making these assessments now. It's a really difficult decision, but a lot depends on the kind of football they want to play, whether they think that Stefan Kuntz is a smart enough guy tactically to coach the first team is another question. But I can't really see any outstanding candidates other than him. And as I say, I'm not sure he's necessarily outstanding. I think he would just make the most sense at the moment.
In your book, you bring up, obviously it's in English, but you bring up different German words such as Lehrer and Kompetenz and Mensch. And obviously you're the only one here who speaks any German. How important is knowing the German language, or at least a few key words? How important is that to just understanding Germany's football and culture? Because I mean, you can see it not only in German but in Spanish. There are just certain words that don't really have an English translation, and
I think that's it.
It can only be understood in German, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think it's true. It's not just something specific to the German language. You could have it in almost any language. I think some expressions are just a natural fit in some languages, and that's the beauty of language. That's something that is really marvelous about discovering a new place, that you have a turn of phrase or there's an expression that only really fits in that language. And I tried my best to display some of those things because I think it's important to reflect those words, because I think those words are a reflection of the football culture in this country. The way in which the words are used, it's really important. And I think it was Frank Wilmund, who said to me, when he was coaching in Turkey with Joachim Löw, I think they talked to each other about it, and I think it was Löw who said to him, we can't connect with the player's soul if we don't speak the language. And I think that's quite telling. I think it's not necessarily just having one or two words. I think that can make all the difference if you're coming into a new situation. You mentioned earlier, young English coaches going to Germany. I think if you had a handful of football phrases on the training ground, I think that would really endear you to a group of players who maybe would then see, oh, look, he's making an effort. But I think to truly connect with someone on a soulful level, as it were, you do need to be able to speak the language. And again, we come back to humans here. Those 11, 15, 18, 25 players that you've got in your squad, every one of them has aspirations and desires that are not just limited to the football pitch. They also have families and people involved in their lives. And, they've come from their own background. They've had their own, adventure to get to where they are and be in the team that you're coaching. And that's something to consider. I certainly wanted to talk about those words and to illuminate the different attributes in German, because German language is a very beautiful thing. It's suffered over the years historically for obvious reasons, but I think with further exploration, you can see the logic behind it. One of the words that was really important I talk about in the prologue, but basically the book is all about that, is Mensch, and that's literally translated. That means people catcher, which sounds a little bit sinister, but it's actually about finding someone that you are willing to follow, and ultimately, that's what Jurgen Klopp is his best example of that. But there are many coaches who are Menschenfängers in different ways. You don't always have to be someone that is extremely extroverted with their passion, but you can still be someone that you would run through a brick wall for as a player. And I think that's a word that doesn't really translate, but it is a deeply ingrained thing in German football culture and also German culture generally. So. Yeah, I was keen to explore that, and I think language is something so important. It's easy as English is one of the the language of the world, as we so often hear, but there is so much beauty in other languages, and I think having the opportunity to illuminate that was just a small part of this.
Yeah, and as an English Brighton supporter who covers German football, it's pretty evident that the relationships just with money between the Premier League and the Bundesliga are pretty much day and night. How would you distinguish and characterize the differences in terms of the relationships with money between the Premier League and the Bundesliga? Because I think that it also has an impact when it comes to just coaching and players and young players, getting opportunities.
Yeah, I think a lot of young players in the Bundesliga get opportunities because a lot of them are brought through youth ranks here, and there's less money at stake. And I think at that stage, and before you make it, as it were, you're not stumbling over large amounts of money. Clubs have already talked about this, how in recent years it's become easier for them to get players from the Premier League, but in the past it wasn't so easy because young players from the Premier League, you have situations where players would say, why would I go to the Bundesliga when I could earn more money staying in England? I think players are now, I think that's changing, because I think the opportunity to play is now outweighing the opportunity to earn money. I think that's definitely changing. I think that also has an impact on coaching. As a coach, if you know that your players are perhaps motivated in a different way, that's difficult. Or you are limited in the players that you can recruit based on the financial limitations of your club. That's also difficult. But as I said earlier, that's forced the Bundesliga clubs to be more creative and to explore different areas of recruitment. That's only been a positive for the Bundesliga, because you end up with players that you might not have otherwise seen if we were all following the same drum. I think that also has an impact on ticket pricing. I think that's something that's been well documented over the years. But I think if things were to change in Germany in the future, then that would be one of the biggest things that's affected. I think Germany is still very protective of the match day experience, and giving or making that open and an option for a millionaire as well as your everyday person. I think that's something that's really beneficial. In the Premier League, that's become harder and harder. And I think the pressure being put on, supporters' wallets is completely unfair, and it shows a lack of interest in the people that uphold and make a football club. I think that's also a wider conversation, but certainly something in my experience is that Bundesliga clubs tend to have an appreciation that they are a representation of a community, and the values of that community is reflected, or at least try to be reflected, in the football club. And they are distinctly aware, at least in my experience, that the people who visit and who support that football club are the reason that the football club exists. And if it was for money, they may have more opportunities to win trophies, but the people who are around them, that support is way more important. I think the hard part in the Premier League or in England is that there are a distinct group of passionate fans in the Premier League. Every single club has them, but they're being priced out and they're being voiced out, and they are less and less important than the people who are watching the game at home on the television, wherever they are in the world. And I think that's extremely traumatic, because ultimately, what is a football club? What does Manchester United represent? What does Brighton and Hove Albion represent? It represents the community for which they play. And if football clubs begin to forget that in pursuit of financial gain or profit, then I think, that's an extreme problem that will only end up in further crises down the road, because then you start to move away from human values or coaching values or community values, and you start to move towards profit and loss columns. And I think that's extremely dangerous. At the moment, the Bundesliga seems to have that balance right. I think that's the biggest difference. They obviously can't compete in the transfer market, but what's the payoff for that? Payoff for that is that you have a fan base based on the 50+1 rule at the moment, which obviously prevents one person having a majority share in a football club. You have a fan base that still has power, that still has a voice that can be heard and can make changes. And I think that's really important, because if we're going to talk about professional sport, then it's obvious that professional sport in most cases is about profit. But I think in many cases, if the profit can be balanced, or at least ideally outweighed by the value of a community, then I think we haven't really lost sight of what sport is all about. And I do sometimes fear that in the Premier League that's in danger of happening. You'd have to ask people who are there more regularly than I am, but as a Brighton fan who doesn't go to as many games as he'd obviously like to, living in Germany, I think fans work really hard to keep that community together, but I don't know how strongly they feel that the club cares about their interests. I think that would be quite telling, though, if you ask that question. I certainly feel in the Bundesliga, almost every fan would say, yeah, my voice, every club member here feels valued in some respects. That might change in the future, but for now, I think that's probably the biggest difference.
Right. Finally, if there was one thing that you wish the Premier League or just English football in general could replicate and learn from German football, one thing that's feasible, what would it be?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, it's tempting to say to returning to a state in which football fans are not treated like customers, because I think that's really where the truth of what a football club should be begins. I think English football a while ago certainly had that, and I think German football not was jealous, but certainly has often talked about the passion of the game in England being so brilliant and so raw. I think that's perhaps gone a little bit lost in recent years through, not necessarily, I don't even think it's the fault of the fans there. I think it's the fault of the circumstance and the developments in the league. But I think if I could see anything, I would love to see a greater return to a dialogue between football fans and the football clubs that they support. Just a greater level of conversation and appreciation between the two. When I watch Bundesliga games on the weekend, and every weekend there seems to be a fan group in a different stadium standing up for a social issue or responding to something that the club has done. And I know that happens in England as well, in fanzines, and it's not like it doesn't happen. But I would love to see clubs be willing to engage more in the UK. I think there's such a great distance between upstairs officials and people who represent the club and fans. I would love to see clubs have more open training sessions and not treat them like this one-off event of every year. I'd love to see clubs open up more and recognize their fans and hold more events. Every year Bayern Munich have their players go around to local fan groups in Bavaria and going around and meeting people and sitting in and having an afternoon with these groups. That's something that's so important. Open training sessions are basically your standard here. Every club has them almost all the time, it feels like, and fans get the opportunity to be close, and get autographs and be close to their sporting heroes. You've got to remove the distance. I think that's what you've got to do in England. You've got to re-establish the connection between the club and its community, because I think that's easy to do in a stadium when you're 3-0 down against Barcelona and you have a brilliant performance. There's no doubt that the connection there is improved, just taking Liverpool as an example. But I think more can be done, and training sessions and community visits and, visiting fan groups around the region. That's really important. That's something that I think can be improved upon and should be improved upon. And mostly that dialogue, having a conversation more often between the two, because without that, it does feel very much like, fans are customers, and that's the last thing that should be the case.
All right. Well, thank you, Jonathan. That's at JONBLOGGS66 on Twitter.
Correct. Thank you very much. No, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me on. It's been great to chat.
No worries. You can find Mensch available on ocklybooks.co as well as Amazon and any select bookshops in particular?
Mostly, I imagine most people in the US will be able to order it in Amazon, but yeah, most bookshops in the UK have it. And if you can't find it on Amazon, then it's obviously on Ockley, as you mentioned. So,
great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and hope to have you on again soon. Good.